when the world started shutting down in the spring of 2020. I remember thinking, this will blow over in a few weeks. A lot of us thought that. Didn't we? Back then, I'd been working at a digital marketing agency, clocking in from 9 to 5 and barely making it back in time to take my dog, Max, out for his evening walk. Max, a big-hearted golden retriever, was my one true anchor. I didn't have family close by, and my friends were scattered across different states. But Max was my steady, reliable friend. The one who'd wait by the door every night, his tail wagging, his eyes full of trust. When the lockdown was announced, I was relieved at first. It felt like an unexpected holiday, a rare chance to breathe without rushing anywhere. I had no idea that it would turn into a test of endurance, a slow unraveling of my own limits. Those first few weeks felt surreal, working from home, cooking my meals, spending my entire day in a small apartment with only Max for company. The world outside grew quieter, and with every passing day, that silence became heavier. As the weeks passed, the isolation became stifling. The city I loved felt hollow, almost like a ghost town, stripped of its noise and energy. I began avoiding the news, but it was impossible to ignore the rising numbers and the stories of people suffering. The uncertainty gnawed at me, and without realizing it, I began depending on Max in ways I hadn't before. He could sense my unease. Every time my shoulders slumped or I let out a deep sigh, he would come over, press his warm head into my lap, and let out a soft huff as if to say, I'm here. I started taking longer walks with Max, wandering down empty streets. With so few people around, it felt like the city belonged to us. Each evening, we'd walk for hours, exploring quiet alleyways and side streets I'd never noticed before. Max loved it, his nose twitching as he picked up new scents, his eyes scanning the world with curiosity. For him, the world was still full of wonder, and I envied that. His joy was contagious, and for a brief moment, I would feel a lightness that I hadn't felt in weeks. It was on one of those walks that I realized just how much Max had become my anchor. He was the one constant, the friend who asked for nothing yet gave me everything. He was my family, my home, and as long as he was with me, I felt like I could get through anything. The days blurred together, one after another, until it was hard to tell if it was a Monday or a Saturday. My routines became a repetitive cycle of work calls, long walks, and hours of scrolling through social media, reading headlines that only deepened the anxiety knotting in my chest. It felt strange, this constant hum of dread, like an alarm I couldn't switch off. Max became my lifeline. His daily walks were a way of finding some kind of rhythm, and each time we stepped outside, he gave me a reason to feel grounded. But it wasn't enough to keep the fear at bay. I started to obsess over the smallest details, washing my hands every time I touched a door handle, wiping down groceries, even cleaning Max's paws after each walk. It was exhausting, and I knew it, but I couldn't shake the anxiety. I was hyper-aware of every tickle in my throat, every cough from a passing stranger. I'd never felt so vulnerable, like the walls of my little apartment could no longer keep the world out. Max, though, remained a steady presence. Every time I sank into my own worries, he'd come over, resting his head on my lap, looking up at me with those gentle, soulful eyes. He seemed to understand my stress, and sometimes I wondered if he worried about me too. He had his own routines, like always nudging my elbow when he wanted an ear scratch or curling up beside me when I collapsed on the couch. No matter how tense or exhausted I felt, Max was there, his presence grounding me. I started to believe that maybe I could manage, that maybe everything would eventually be okay if not for me, then for him. As time passed, I realized I had to do something to break free from the anxiety that had wrapped itself around my mind. The world felt chaotic and beyond my control, but there were things I could control, like helping those who were worse off. That's when I began volunteering to deliver groceries and essentials to elderly residents in my building. It was a small act, a way to remind myself that life went on, and people still needed each other. Max was my faithful companion on these deliveries. Every time we dropped off a package, he'd wag his tail enthusiastically, as if he knew he was doing something important. I'd watch him sit proudly by the door, his tail swishing like he was waiting for his next assignment. The neighbors adored him, and he seemed to bring them a bit of joy, even if only for a moment. I wasn't the only one who needed a reminder that we weren't alone, that there was still kindness in the world, even if it was only between a man, his dog, and the people they quietly helped. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of purpose. It wasn't about what I could gain, it was about giving back. Each delivery was a small connection, a reminder that someone else was benefiting from my presence. I began to see Max not just as my companion but as my partner. We were a team, navigating this strange world together, finding meaning in small acts of kindness. The more time I spent with Max, the more I noticed how intuitive he was. He could sense things in people that I couldn't. On one delivery, we met an older woman named Mrs. Olson. She had this quiet loneliness about her, and she spent most of her days in her small apartment, watching old films and crocheting. Max was drawn to her immediately. Each time we dropped by, he'd tug at his leash, eager to sit by her feet and let her pat him gently. For a few minutes, she'd forget about her solitude, lost in Max's companionship. Our volunteer work took on new meaning. Max's joy was contagious, and it seemed like each delivery brought a little more light into both our lives. For the first time, I was building connections, albeit from a distance. Mrs. Olson started leaving notes for me to find. Little thank yous and encouraging words. She even left a small crocheted blanket from Max for your faithful friend, she wrote. That gift moved me more than I'd expected. It felt like a sign that, even in a world that seemed like it was falling apart, there was still space for kindness, for love. Through those months, Max became more than a dog. He was my partner, my anchor, and my inspiration. He reminded me of the power of simple presence, of loyalty and love, even in the most uncertain times. And as our connection deepened, I realized that the life I'd been living before rushing from one deadline to the next, chasing promotions and paychecks, had left me missing the most important things. It was Max who taught me to slow down, to appreciate each moment, to find joy in the quiet and in the kindness shared between strangers. I found myself letting go of the fear, replacing it with a deep sense of gratitude for each day we had together, for the companionship he gave me without question or condition. By the time winter rolled around, Max and I had developed a comfortable routine. Our volunteer deliveries slowed as restrictions eased, and the world, little by little, seemed to creep back to life. I noticed my neighbors stepping outside more, small glimpses of cautious hope returning to the streets. It was comforting, in a way, to see the world breathing again. And I felt a faint stirring of hope myself, something I hadn't felt in a long time. But then, almost without warning, Max began to slow down. It started subtly. He would hesitate before getting up, take longer to climb the stairs. At first, I thought it was just the winter chill settling into his joints. But one day, as we returned from a short walk, he collapsed on the hallway floor, panting heavily. A wave of fear washed over me, and I found myself kneeling beside him, rubbing his back, whispering that everything would be all right. The vet's office was a quiet, sterile place, and as we waited, Max looked up at me with those same trusting eyes that had carried me through the hardest days. After a series of tests, the vet explained that Max was aging faster than expected. Arthritis had set in, and his heart was weaker than before. He may not have much time left, she said gently, offering a sympathetic smile. Hearing those words hit me harder than I could have imagined. For so long, Max had been my reason to keep going, my companion in a world that often felt too heavy. The thought of losing him was a weight I couldn't bear. The days that followed were filled with a mix of gratitude and grief. I was thankful for every moment I had with him. Yet a sadness loomed over me, a reminder that our time together was limited. I took care of him the best I could, slowing down our routines, adjusting to his pace. He seemed to sense that things were different, that I was watching him a little closer, treating each moment with a tenderness I hadn't known before. Despite his fading strength, Max never stopped looking at me with those same unwavering eyes, as if he were still carrying me through each day, reminding me that love, in its simplest form, is enough. I spent those days replaying memories of our time together. Every walk, every shared moment, every silent reassurance he'd offered me through the hardest days of the pandemic. Max was more than a pet. He was my reminder that even in a world full of uncertainty, there was a love that didn't waver. And that thought, though bittersweet, helped me carry on, to stay strong for him as he had been for me. The day Max passed was one of those quiet days, the kind that might pass without notice. He was lying on his favorite blanket, the one Mrs. Olson had made for him, and I was sitting beside him, holding his paw, as if somehow I could keep him there, keep him with me a little longer. But Max, ever wise, seemed to know it was time. He looked up at me with those same gentle eyes, filled with the same love and loyalty he'd given me every day. And then, as softly as he'd entered my life, he slipped away, leaving me with a silence that felt heavier than anything I'd known. In the days that followed, I felt hollow, as if some essential part of me was missing. The apartment was quiet without his paws patting on the floor, his eager face greeting me in the morning. For weeks, I went through my days feeling lost, unsure of how to fill the emptiness he'd left behind. But as time passed, I found myself reaching for the memories he'd given me, the lessons he'd taught me. I began writing, pouring out every memory, every small moment we'd shared. It was my way of keeping him with me, of honoring the love and loyalty he'd shown me through the darkest days. And somewhere in that writing, I found a sense of peace, a reminder that Max had given me more than companionship. He had given me the strength to carry on. I started a small online community, a space for people to share stories of their own losses, their own journeys through love and grief. People from all walks of life joined, sharing memories of their pets, their loved ones, their experiences through the pandemic. It was a community bound by loss but also by resilience, by a shared understanding that even in the hardest times, love could be a powerful anchor. Through those stories, I found healing, a sense of connection that I hadn't expected. Max's memory lived on, not just in my heart but in the hearts of those who shared their own stories, who understood the depth of companionship and loyalty. In a way, he was still with me, guiding me, teaching me to carry his legacy forward in the lives he'd touched. Over time, I learned to move forward, to find joy in the small moments, just as Max had taught me. I found peace in the silence, in the memories that still felt alive, in the love that didn't fade. Max had given me a gift, One that stayed with me long after he was gone, a reminder that love, in all its forms, is a powerful, enduring force. Months had passed, and though life had begun to feel normal again, there were still moments when I'd look at Max's old collar hanging by the door and feel a pang of loss. It was a gentle ache, one that reminded me of all he'd meant to me. But it wasn't as heavy anymore. I'd come to understand that grief, in its own way, transforms over time. It's never really gone, but it changes shape, becoming part of you rather than weighing you down. One rainy afternoon, I was sitting in my usual spot by the window, the gray sky mirroring my quiet, reflective mood. I had Max's blanket draped over my lap, a comfort I found myself reaching for more often on days like these. I was scrolling through the posts on the online community I'd started, reading stories from others who'd experienced their own journeys through love, loss, and healing. I'd lost track of the number of stories shared, each one a tribute to a pet, a loved one, or even a stranger who had touched their lives. That afternoon, a post caught my eye. It was from a woman named Lily, who just lost her elderly dog, Finn. Her words mirrored my own journey with Max, the companionship, the strength, the loyalty. I reached out to her, leaving a comment that I hoped would bring her some comfort. Soon, we began exchanging messages, sharing our memories, our struggles, our moments of resilience. There was an understanding between us, a shared bond that needed no explanation. Over the next few weeks, our messages became more frequent. Lily lived just outside the city, in a small town upstate. One weekend, she invited me to visit, suggesting that the quiet countryside might offer a welcome change of pace. I hesitated at first, but something in me, a curiosity, a desire to connect, pushed me to say yes. The drive was peaceful, the open road a stark contrast to the dense, bustling city I'd known for so long. When I arrived at her place, a modest, cozy house surrounded by trees, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. She welcomed me with a warm smile, and we spent the afternoon sharing stories, laughing about our pets' quirks, reminiscing about the moments that had shaped us. As the sun began to set, Lily took me for a walk along a trail behind her house, a path that wound through tall trees and opened onto a small, quiet clearing. There, in the golden light, she spoke about Finn, about the comfort he'd given her, the lessons he'd taught her. I felt as though I was hearing my own story reflected back to me, a reminder that love, in its simplest form, was a universal language. As we walked back, we passed a small shelter nearby. A few dogs were in the yard, their tails wagging eagerly as they watched us. I found myself drawn to one in particular, a scruffy mutt with a wise look in his eyes. He sat patiently, his gaze steady, almost as if he were waiting for someone he recognized. I felt a flicker of something familiar, a gentle nudge in my heart, as though Max were there, urging me forward. Without a word, Lily and I stepped toward the shelter, both of us smiling, both of us knowing that sometimes, love finds its way back to you, even when you least expect it. The scruffy dog met my gaze, his tail wagging slowly, and in that moment, I felt the quiet weight of understanding, of connection, and of the possibility of a new beginning. And as I reached out to him, I felt a sense of peace, a sense of purpose, and the comforting realization that Max's legacy would live on not just in my heart, but in the love I was ready to share again.